All right, guys. I know it's just been a little while since I made a video about this guy, Chris MacAskill. Um, Unfortunately, he released an interview with a paleoanthropologist on just the day that I think I dropped mine, or maybe a couple days after. I am in the anthropology department at UWC. I have interest in paleoanthropology, although it's not really a specialization. My interest is very sort of broad human history over the long term, kind of a paper that I've written, my dissertation. So anyway, so let's see what he has to say. I think based on the last video, we can pretty much guarantee he's going to get a lot of things wrong. So let's see what he says.
Imagine me getting an invitation to speak at a conference of low-carb diet influencers, some of whom...
Citizen Science Foundation. So this is Nick Norwitz, Dave Feldman. They've made friends with this guy, MacAskill. Yeah, I appreciate the attempts to reach across the aisle. I'm just not sure this is the guy you want to be reaching across to. But whatever.
Advocate a carnivore diet. It reminded me of a Sesame Street episode.
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other?
I feel like one of those things that doesn't belong. That's because I advocate plant-dominant diets like Mediterranean.
Mediterranean is not a diet, it is a sea. Okay, and there are many, many different cultures, including North African cultures that live across the Mediterranean Sea in the Mediterranean region and have some long-lived populations, including Icaria and Sardinia, which have been talked about as ad nauseum, but many more as well, right? So, and it's not the only place that has those populations, right? So, and when we, yeah, so there's no such thing as a Mediterranean diet is where we'll leave it for now.
Asian, vegetarian, and vegan, and those diets are rarely low carb. Eager to share my point of view with respect at the conference, I wanted to know my audience, so I listened to the super popular carnivore doctor, Ken Berry.
If you ask any paleoanthropologist, they're like, well, yeah, we're basically effectively super carnivore. 70% of our food comes from animals, and it has.
So there's a technical term, which is hyper carnivore, which is that 70% number and more. And yes, ancestral humans do seem to be in that category. However, I don't think it's the case, Dr. Ken, that everyone would agree with that, like in the paleoanthropology world. Certainly, I think it's gaining more and more traction because the evidence coming out from nitrogen isotope analysis seems pretty clear. In fact, when you look at that data, it's hard to reconcile. It's hard to even imagine people eating that much meat in some cases. Makes us think that actually they were eating maybe carnivores, because that would skew the data even higher. But anyway, regardless of what's going on, I think saying that it's 100% of paleoanthropologists, a bit of an exaggeration.
For 2.5 million years.
I had never heard that before, and I happened to be on my way to meet the super famous paleoanthropologist.
So the fact that you've never heard it before just means that you haven't been paying attention to the literature, because this is an idea it's not that new. I think the major breakthrough was 2019 or so. Again, the stable nitrogen isotope analysis, using that as a methodology. It was talked about before that, but the paper I have in mind is 2019, I think. It's fine to say when you don't know something, but why are you bragging about your ignorance at a time when it's not really relevant?
If I asked you what's the most important cell in the body, what would you say? Would you say the cardiac cell, the heart cell? Would you say the hepatic cell, the liver cell? Would you say some kind of immune cell? The answer, my friends, is none of these. The answer of the most important cell in the body is stem cells, because they can become any of those things and more. We are born producing stem cells, but unfortunately, as we age, our production of stem cells goes down. Fortunately, there is a way to increase our endogenous production of stem cells even as we get older. To find out more, click the link on your screen.
Daniel Lieberman in his office. Dr. Lieberman's books are fascinating, and
So Lieberman is fascinating, I agree, but his focus, and I think it's even in his job title, like he is the chair of something like biomedical skeletal research or something. He's an interesting person, and he knows a lot about exercise and sitting and posture and that kind of stuff. And sort of why humans walk upright is sort of, I think, his starting point, or the question that got him started. But asking him about diet and nutrition may be a waste of time. We'll see.
I recommend them to everyone because he talks about sitting, diet, exercise, and how our ancestors evolved. Other books I've read and loved by paleoanthropologists.
What's up with this? I mean, what are you saying? Like, what you've read and loved is not relevant to this discussion, is it?
Are Evolution's Bite, A Story of Teeth, Diet, and Human Origins by Peter Unger, Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human by Richard Wrangham, Burn by Herman Ponzer, and this beautiful book by...
So these are all like, what he's showing you here is that he has some basic knowledge of popular anthropology. None of those are books, except for the Ponzer thing probably, none of those are books that we have to sort of study in detail when we take anthropology classes and so on, right? So I don't know what he's saying. He's just saying that he knows a bit about pop anthropology.
By Alice Roberts, which I had to buy a paper copy of because the artwork inside is just so amazing. Don't you think this guy had to be the Brad Pitt of his day? I was in Dr. Lieberman's office
Yeah, amazing artwork is, how is amazing artwork relevant to this video?
because he's giving a talk on exercise at the longevity conference I'm organizing for TED. But before I left, I asked if my friend Miguel and I could ask him a few questions about his books. His office, by the way, is in the amazing Peabody Museum of Paleoarchaeology at Harvard. I thought it would be pretty ironic if we sat for the interview, so we stood. I have questions. Sitting. What'd you ever conclude in your book on sitting?
Well, sitting is something that we, I think, unfairly demonize. All animals sit. Dogs sit, moose sit, chickens sit, and humans sit. And there's this kind of myth that goes around that today people sit ridiculous amounts of time, and it's the new smoking, and our chairs are out to kill us, and all that. And it is true. If you don't get physical activity, that can cause increase your risk of all kinds of diseases. But hunter-gatherers sit just as much as Americans, right? Typical hunter-gatherer in Tanzania sits about 10 hours a day.
But they squat for a couple hours a day, right?
They do. When they sit, so there are differences, right? So how they sit is different. So it's the way that we sit that's actually the problem, right? And so we tend to sit in a very inert fashion. We sit in chairs that have backs. Our sitting requires essentially no energy. And furthermore, we tend to sit for really long, uninterrupted periods, right? Whereas if you go to non-Western societies where chairs aren't ubiquitous, people tend to squat, so they're engaging their leg muscles. They don't have backrest, so they're engaging some of their back muscles, and that turns like their muscles on a little bit, right? They're doing a little bit of something. It's like turning your car on, even if you're not driving. It engages the engine, right? And in addition, Americans, people in the West, tend to sit for long, uninterrupted periods for several hours at a time, right? Sitting there staring into a computer or watching TV. But in traditional societies, people tend to get up about every 10 to 15 minutes. And again, that turns on it's like turning on the engine. So it's not that we sit so much, it's that we sit so much for long, uninterrupted periods. And that is what causes, increases inflammation, increases the blood sugar levels, increases fat levels in our blood. All of that amounts to.
It's not clear to me that would happen if there wasn't underlying metabolic going on. So, I mean, I can't really fault him for anything he said, but I think when you're studying modern human populations, you have to ask which is the variable of interest. And sitting is one, but you can't get someone who's not, for example, taking, I don't know, junk food or highly processed sugary foods, etc. So there may be several variables going on when we see these elevation in blood sugars. And I don't think we would see that even if we had some of the communities that I work with, for example, the Khoisan, etc. If we took them and made them sit for 2 hours, I don't think you'd see an elevation in blood sugar, for example.
To damage.
So I'm about to tell on you because I'm in your office here at Harvard, and I see your chair, and you don't have a stand-up desk, and you're not sitting on a beanbag.
I do have a stand-up desk.
Oh, you do?
Yes, my desk goes up and down.
Oh, that's how it works. Oh, I see. Oh, it does. Oh, I'm busted.
But I see a Bosu ball.
But
saying, right?
I mean, look, I'm not religious about it. Look, there's no evidence that stand-up desks are necessarily bad for you. I mean, one of the things that's, if you look at the epidemiological data, it's actually not work time sitting that's associated with poor health outcomes. It's leisure time sitting.
Oh, really?
So if you spend all your day sitting at work, and then you also drive to get to work, and then when you get home, you drive home to get off work, and then you spend the rest of the evening sitting in a couch, etc., watching TV, then you're in trouble. But
so this is again epidemiological data, and how do you isolate the variable of interest? People who are sitting home, after work, I don't know, there may be other things going on with their lives that they're not going to the gym, they're not going out for walks, etc. Right? So just saying that it's the sitting that's the problematic behavior, maybe, but we can't conclude that definitively.
The evidence is that people who go to work and they sit at their desk for 7-8 hours a day, but then engage in some other kinds of activity, there's no real evidence that they're causing that much harm. So I think we should stop unfairly demonizing sitting. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. Let's just sit better, right? Sit more actively and interrupt our sitting more frequently.
I heard a nephrologist say, when you're on an airplane, don't sit for more than an hour without walking up and down the aisle, because the kidneys have poor circulation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why by getting up and moving every once in a while, your kidneys, your venous system, the return to your blood to your heart requires muscles to pump it, right? So
this just seems common sense to me.
Your blood pools in your legs, for example. Muscles, even just getting up and just getting a cup of tea or going to the bathroom can turn on your muscles and turn all kinds of genes in your muscles. We don't even know exactly what they're doing. So just again, it's okay to sit. Don't be scared about sitting. But if you do sit, get up every once in a while.
So a lot of longevity books with regard to exercise talk about resistance training and balance. But isn't there data coming out now that things like racket sports are even better for longevity? Tennis, have you lived long, soccer and so on? Because I don't know why. Maybe because they're social, maybe because they're fun, maybe because they add coordination. You mentioned a few of these things in your book, but I didn't hear you mention types of exercise for longevity.
Yeah, because trying to relate a particular exercise to longevity is pretty complicated, right? For example, people who play tennis also tend to be richer than people who don't play tennis. So it's
exactly, and people who are vegetarian or vegan also tend to be richer as well, right? So trying to extrapolate anything from the epidemiology, I mean, it's again at best you can postulate a hypothesis for further testing.
It's a kind of dangerous game.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that, but I would say that we know that the bedrock of physical activity is aerobic physical activity, aerobic exercise, what we call.
mean, I suppose so. Your lungs and heart have to work for everything, but I don't really agree with that. I mean, um, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of populations. In fact, I would say nearly all pre-modern populations that seem to have fine cardiovascular activity and don't really do any such thing as exercise per se. I mean, they're active, meaning they move, but they don't really do exercise, right? So I don't know.
Cardio, right? That's important for your cardiovascular system. It's important for metabolism. It's important for your brain. It's important for all kinds of things. But weights are also important, right? Especially as we age. That keeps your muscles strong. It prevents frailty. Prevents this vicious cycle of sarcopenia when your muscles start losing mass and then you become less active and then you do less of everything. So look, there's some mix of aerobic physical activity and resistance physical activity that are important for health. But it's not a medicine. We tend to medicalize exercise and run into trouble, right? Because what are you worried about? Are you worried about cancer? Are you worried about heart disease? Are you worried about?
And this I agree. I mean, if you want to tailor an exercise routine or frankly even a diet to your particular needs, you have to ask what are your particular goals, right? So I kind of agree. I would put it a little bit more in starker terms, I think. But I think he's more or less on the right track here.
But Alzheimer's, or you're worried about type 2 diabetes? Are you young? Are you old? Do you have a limp in your leg? I mean, there's no one recipe, there's no one medicine, there's no one dose that has a determined effect. The simple answer is that some exercise is better than none. More is better up to a certain point, and then there's really no extra added benefit. And you got to mix it up. And
so, yeah, he said there's no extra added benefit, but at a certain point you get overtrained, and that's actually a harm, right? So important to say that because many people just think exercise, the more I do, the better, and there's no harm at the end of that. No, if you do too much exercise, you are doing yourself harm, definitely.
Do it as long as you're alive, right? Don't ever stop being physically active, because as we get older, physical activity becomes, if anything, more important, not less important. But trying to figure out what's the optimal dose and the optimal exercise, I don't think that's a really sensible way. That's medicalizing exercise, and I don't think that's very healthy.
Fascinating. So I was listening to some carnivores.
These are carnivorous humans, you mean?
Yeah, well, modern carnivores.
not wolves.
Right.
Yeah,
no,
okay.
they just eat beef. Humans who eat beef and say it's the perfect optimal diet, the only true diet. So they say that every paleontologist in the world, they say this emphatically, every paleoanthropologist in the world agrees that we evolved eating meat for the last 2 million years. It's our evolutionary diet.
So as I mentioned, I think that's a bit of an overstatement, but that's the direction in which the data is leading us, right?
Diet. And we're crazy if we don't make our diets all meat. What do you say?
Well, it's true that we evolved.
I don't think anyone says you're crazy if you don't make your diet all meat. I mean, I think you're putting up a bit of a straw man.
Eat meat, and in some parts of the world, people ate actually a lot of meat. Like, for example, in Arctic environments, right? There's not a lot of food to eat other than meat, right? But if you look at tropical hunter-gatherers, maybe about 30% of their calories comes from meat. So
that number, 30%, is super important. The more I look at the data, the more I conclude that that's sort of the minimum amount of meat consumption that's compatible with sort of a healthy human population.
So let's not exaggerate how much meat our ancestors ate. Secondly, the meat that they ate is very different from the meat that we tend to eat today, right? Wild game has much less saturated fat, and it's just healthier.
So the fat in meat is not saturated. Number one, it's mostly MUFA, monounsaturated, especially in beef. Secondly, we cannot conclude from looking around at wild animals today that are lean, we cannot conclude that that's how animals used to be 20,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. In fact, we know that those megafauna had a lot more fat. And this is, again, related to the nitrogen isotope analysis and so on that you can figure out, what percentage of the animal was fat, what percentage of the animal was lean. And the bigger the animal is, the more fat it has, right? And humans were hunting 20,000 years ago these massive animals, or 50,000 years ago, whatever, right? And around 12,000 years ago, there was an event. The nature of that event is debated, but something happened which caused, and humans may have played a role. In fact, we know humans did play a role, but how big that role is something that's being debated. How big of a role that is being debated. So anyway, so the point of the story is, prior to 12,000 years ago, which coincidentally is exactly when agriculture begins to be a thing, there were massive animals on the planet that humans could and did hunt. Massive beavers, massive wombats in Australia, massive all kinds of things. And those things had enough fat that humans would have been able to survive on them, right?
It probably matters what humans ate a long time ago. That probably matters a lot. And so I really started to read in the archaeological literature, and then later the anthropological literature, and then later the paleoanthropological literature. And that's when it became self-evident to me, as self-evident as it is to all paleoanthropological researchers, is that from the...
So I think I think is a bit of an exaggeration. You can find, there's always going to be debate in these kind of fields, especially with things we can't know with 100% certainty, right? So yeah, you should be careful not to overstate things, Ken.
Beginning of our species, about 300,000 years ago, we have eaten as much fatty meat as we could get our hands on. And so there's this principle in biology. I had my undergraduate in animal biology. So there's this principle called adaptation. And so what that word means in biology is when a species has been doing something for a long damn time, so millions and millions of years, that species has adapted to that. And not only can they tolerate it, they've learned to actually optimize on that.
And finally, I think the biggest problem with this argument is that just because our ancestors evolved to do something doesn't mean it's healthy. That's what we call a paleo fantasy. Right?
So I think you can say that for other things, right? So for like open fires is an example. We can clearly see in the paleoanthropological record when humans started cooking on open fires, lung disease became a thing, right? And there's lots of, people probably died young. Heart disease became a thing to some extent, although to a very small extent, but still. So I think you can make that argument for a lot of things. Can you make it for diet? Can you name another animal that, let's say we take that animal out of the wild, we put it in the zoo, we give it a diet other than what it's accustomed to, and the animal does better in the zoo than it does in the wild? No, I don't think you can name such an animal. And if you cannot name such an animal, why do you presume that humans are such an animal? Why do you presume that the diet that we evolved to eat is not the diet that we're going to thrive on the most? What would lead you to that conclusion?
Right? We evolved for one reason and one reason only, right? To have, as far as evolution is concerned, to have as many offspring as possible. And evolution doesn't care if we get heart disease when we're in our 60s or cancer in our 70s or
no offense to him, but he looks like an older paleoanthropologist. He may not be familiar, if he's not keeping up with it, of something called the grandmother hypothesis. So we're taught about this in classes these days, where actually there's a hypothesis that the reason humans are so long-lived and the reason that women go through menopause and so on is because the older generation actually has a role to play in the family unit, in the tribe, and so on. And I would say, by the way, that humans aren't the only species that there's evidence for this. I know that orcas also have menopause, just to give one example. So what he's saying is not, yes, there are some people who believe that. Maybe he's one of the people who believe it. But there is this theory being advanced, the grandmother hypothesis, which states that humans evolved to be long-lived. And we know genetically humans can be long-lived. So
whatever, because you already had your children by then, right? So the argument that you should eat something because your ancestors did it is really just silly. I mean, I can't think of any other.
That's not so I would agree. Like, you shouldn't eat, porridge just because your grandmother did or whatever. I agree that that's a silly argument. But looking at what an animal evolved to eat and formulating something like a default diet based on that evolution, that just seems to me to be common sense, right? And he hasn't given any reason for why that wouldn't be. What is it about the human animal that makes us different from every other animal system where we can feed ourselves, I don't know, salads and apples that only evolved a few thousand years ago, or that we helped evolve a few thousand years ago, and think that that's going to be healthy? What is it?
Term, right? I mean, our ancestors also didn't sleep on mattresses, so are they going to give up their mattresses? Our ancestors didn't brush their teeth.
We're not talking about sleep. Brushing teeth is an interesting example because humans had perfect, very good dentition, very perfect dental health until the introduction of plant foods into the diet during the agricultural revolution, right? And even then, it was pretty good until the introduction of sugar much, much later, right? So, so I'm not sure the examples he's giving are that relevant and are even backing up what he thinks. Or they're not saying what I think he thinks they're saying.
Ancestors, didn't have refrigeration or antibiotics or vaccines. I mean, this is a shallow way of thinking. And and if you also look at the epidemiological data, there's just no way around it. Vegetarians live longer than people who eat.
So that is absolutely not true. Again, if you look at, first of all, if you look at centenarians, for example, you look at longer lived people, I think there's a study out of Japan where not a single centenarian was a vegetarian. So that's an interesting little piece of information. Secondly, when we look at the Asian populations in general, we don't find that correlation holding. We only find it with Western populations. And thirdly, when we look at country by country analysis, we find that the more meat a population eats, the longer they live, right? So what he's saying, either he's unfamiliar with this literature or he's only familiar with part of it and giving a very biased view.
A lot of meat.
So what do you think of the Arctic populations who have a mutation in their genes so they can't go into ketosis?
So it's true. There's been selection in enzymes that desaturate certain fats that are more common in Arctic populations. So there's been selection for them to tolerate diets that are low in carbohydrates. Most of us don't have those adaptations, so I don't know why that really matters for most of us. In addition, it's also been claimed that Arctic populations have very low levels.
So in terms of the gene mutation, I agree that it's probably not something to think too much about. It's interesting, and it's interesting to speculate on why those populations evolve those particular genes. But I'm not sure it's relevant. Arctic, people in the far north are born in a state of ketosis, just like people everywhere else are, right? So we're born fat adapted, if you want to think about it that way. So yes, they're processing the fats in slightly different ways, but I'm not sure that that's relevant.
of heart disease. That comes from some old, really bad studies. If you look at actually recent studies that have really look hard at all the data, the evidence is that Arctic populations had pretty much the same level of heart disease as Westerners who are eating.
So I don't think we can conclude that, especially not from the mummy stuff that MacAskill is putting on right now, on the screen right now. It is possible. It seems likely. Let me put it that way. That quote unquote wild humans of various different cultures had some degree of ASCVD. Given what we know about human physiology now, that seems likely. But it also seems to be the case, in fact, I argue this is the null hypothesis in this case, that ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, really only became a problem in the 20th century, even in, Western populations. Not to say that it didn't exist, it did exist, but it was very, 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 very rare, right? So looking at mummies and finding some calcification of the arteries, it's interesting, but it doesn't really tell us much. It doesn't tell us certainly doesn't tell us the answer to the question that we're looking for, which is what is causing the modern plague of cardiovascular disease, which has to be something. Now, it might not be food, might be pollution, it might be something else. But what is the thing that was introduced in the 20th century that led to these skyrocketing effects? The point is that looking at mummies doesn't tell us about the general population. There may be something about the mummies. Why were they mummified? What was it about this person that he got preserved? He might have had a fall, which led to some kind of cardiovascular issue, and that's why he's been preserved in this particular way. So you can't extrapolate too much from a very small subset of population data, especially about cultures we don't know that much about, right? In the case of Egyptian mummies, we know a lot about that culture, so maybe there's more data we can glean from that. But these cultures, I'm not so sure.
Of kind of typical Western diet. So this idea that a high saturated fat diet protects you from heart disease is a myth.
So no one's saying that. What we're saying is there's something, the modern version of ASCVD, however you want to think about it, that has become a plague that leads to the majority of deaths, et cetera, that leads to premature deaths, that leads to heart attacks and strokes in the 40s and 50s and even earlier. That is something new. That is being caused by something new in our environment, right? Just based on the epidemiological data. Given that it's being caused by something new, but it's certainly not coming from animal foods, right? So it's not the meat that humans evolved to eat that's causing the problem, which is majority monounsaturated fat.
Founded. It's based on no serious solid evidence.
What would you recommend to the average person when it comes to?
Okay, so just looking through the bookmarks here: right amount of exercise, exercise and lifespan, exercise intensity, women's fertility and exercise. I don't think there's anything there I want to go into. Just some thoughts. Like I think, first of all, to MacAskill, we're in an era of specialization and subspecialization. So just because you find someone who has paleoanthropologist in their title doesn't mean you find the right person to have this discussion with, number one. Number two, I think that it's useful to think about some of the questions that Lieberman is raising. But again, the question becomes, what's the default here? What is your null hypothesis? And the null hypothesis for me is that an animal will thrive on the diet that it has evolved to eat, right? And if you want to say, no, that's not the case, you got to provide a lot of evidence for that. You got to provide a lot of, a lot of trials, a lot of research, right? A lot of not just epidemiological and population-based data. You want some RCTs, right? If you tell me that actually there's this new uranium-derived food that's going to be the best thing to feed your children, I'm going to want to see a lot of evidence before I give that to my kid, right? So some food for thought. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.